There we go. There we go. That very friendly voice. Well, we have all of our panelists here. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce everybody and get started tonight for LitTalk. I'm really excited about this, just to sit in and listen myself. My name is Blake Kimsey. I'm the executive director of Writing Workshops Dallas, writingworkshops.com, however you found us, and really happy that you're here tonight. And I look forward to these. We pretty much do these every quarter, and we have for maybe the last year and a half or maybe more, since Alex Temblador, our series creator and moderator, came up with this idea to just get writers together to talk about craft, to talk about process, and to ask them a bunch of really cool questions. And Alex Temblador, she is an international freelance writer, travel writer. She's the author of the award-winning Secrets of the Casa Rosada and a forthcoming novel called Half Outlaw, which is forthcoming in July 2022. Is that right, Alex? July?
Yes, July 22.
July 2022. And Alex said, hey, let's get a bunch of poets together in September to talk about writing, craft, all that good stuff. And I'm really happy that we're joined tonight by three really exciting poets. First, I'll introduce Tarfia Faizullah. She is the author of 2 poetry collections. One of them, Registers of Illuminated Villages from Graywolf and Seam from SIU. And in 2016, Tarfia was recognized by Harvard Law School as one of 50 women inspiring change. Tarfia is a 2019 United States Artist Fellow, and although she's dialing in from Chicago today, she does live in Dallas, Texas. Sebastián, who I have known since I moved back to Dallas in 2014, and is one of the most generous members of the national literary community, both in Dallas and beyond. I've been really privileged to know him for such a long time. Sebastián is a CantoMundo Fellow and a former Dobie Paisano Fellow. Sebastián's work has appeared in D Magazine, Southwest Review, New England Review, and elsewhere. He is the founding editor of The Boiler and the poetry editor for Deep Vellum Books, which is just a really great publisher here in Dallas. And they also have a bookstore. He co-curates several reading events, including Pegasus Reading Series, Bandwidth, and The Burning Plain. And he is a visiting assistant professor of English at Austin College in Sherman, Texas. And Mag Gabbert holds a PhD in creative writing from Texas Tech University and an MFA from the University of California at Riverside. She is the author of the chapbook Minimal Poems from Copper Dylan, and her work can also be found in 32 Poems, Pleiades, I always get that wrong, the Paris Review, the Massachusetts Review, Waxwing, and many other journals. She's received poetry fellowships from Idlewild Arts and poetry at Round Top. And in 2021, she was awarded a 92Y Discovery Award. She teaches creative writing at Southern Methodist University. She serves as the interview editor at Underblog Journal, and a point of distinction and pride, was the first ever instructor at Writing Workshops Dallas 4.5 years ago. So welcome to you all. I'm very excited that you're here. Before I hand it over to you, Alex, if y'all have questions, put them in the chat. And then when we're done with the discussion around 7 or whenever we wrap it up, you can ask those live, or I can, or Alex can ask them from the chat. But welcome everybody. We're so happy you're here.
Thank you, Blake. I'm so happy to have Mag, Tarfia, and Sebastián here tonight to talk about poetry. As I am a fiction writer, short story and novel, I'm fascinated with poetry and poets and the way they publish, the way they create their work. And so I'm really excited to talk to all three of you tonight. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to do like a general question to all three of you, and I hope you all have something to offer. All three of you have been published as poets, but you've also written nonfiction. I'm not sure if any of you have written fiction, but I know nonfiction and essays. What does poetry, what can you do with poetry that you just aren't able to do with other genres as a writer? And personally, yeah. So whoever wants to speak up first, go ahead. I'm gonna pick Mag.
I knew it was coming. Yeah, so the first thing that comes to my mind, a friend of mine who's also a poet, her name's Jess Smith, gave this wonderful talk years ago at Texas Tech about poetry. And one of the things that she really highlighted is how you can share a poem on social media, like most of the time in a screenshot, sometimes in a tweet, you know. We have a whole literary journal that's like tweet-sized poems now, the Lickety Split. So one of the things I really value, maybe it's not sort of a function of poetry, but it is a thing, an advantage for poetry, is that maybe if there is something to this whole short attention span, you know, scrolling through life argument that people make sometimes now, you can hear my dog like pacing around back here, that maybe poetry is suited for that. You know, I'll pause and read poems that I see on the feed. And I think maybe that's introducing people who wouldn't normally seek literature out at all to a little bit, you know, some snippets of it here and there.
I guess what I'll add to that is, I don't know, there is the distinction of fiction being fiction, you know, it's made up, and then there's nonfiction or creative nonfiction, where, you know, you're drawing from real life. But I guess what I enjoy about poetry is that it can kind of do the work of both of those genres. It can kind of blur the boundaries of what genre is. And I mean, sometimes I hear friends tell me that, you know, they wrote something as a poem, or it's like a prose poem, and then they publish it as fiction or nonfiction. And I think right now the literary landscape is really welcoming to this blurring of genres that is happening. But I mean, I think you see it most often in poetry. So I think people are still like, fiction is fiction and nonfiction is nonfiction. But I guess I like that with poetry, you can kind of like do all sorts of things. Like for me, sometimes I'll research something for a poem, or I'll, you know, write something that I'm drawing from real life, but then I know that I'm misremembering it, but I'm compressing it, and I'm, you know, maybe fudging some of it, but it still feels emotionally true.
I agree with what Sebastian and Mag have already said, both in terms of poetry being a really efficient form and also a really flexible one. I guess I'll just say that I think I'm not personally invested in genre, the cosmic battle of genre. Like, I'm not invested in whether or not nonfiction is nonfiction or poetry is poetry. But I do think that there are specific traditions. And so I think what you consume inside of those traditions has to do with maybe what your intentions are as a writer, or what you feel really comfortable or excited, whatever genre you feel really comfortable and excited by. And I'm thinking about, hey, for example, how the Iliad or the Odyssey are arguably, you know, you could make an argument for it as a lyric poem. You can make an argument for it as a novel in some ways. Either way, I think that I would like to think that in some ways poetry is sort of the original, the very OG genre, only because it's an oral tradition and all storytelling began there. And I think that writing as an oral tradition is interesting to me because it means that it's available to the illiterate to be able to still create narratives, still create literature without necessarily having writing, which, you know, I mean, like this kind of writing, which for a long time, for a lot of people, was actually a privilege.
I really like what you said there, Tarfia, whenever you were speaking about the oral tradition of poetry, which I think is something, that we still see today in things like the Pegasus Reading Series that Sebastian and, you know, Mag do. Would either one of you like to kind of expand on that, on why poetry is still like a very performative art in some ways? Yeah.
Or,
Were you going to say something, Sebastian?
oh, you can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of intersection between poetry, music, and the lyrics of music. And there's also this whole kind of sub-genre or separate genre of like poems meant to be performed. I'm thinking about slam, for example. And I get asked this question a lot, sort of like, or a variation of it, like what is the difference between slam and poetry on the page, or is there a difference, or is there a difference between song lyrics? And I think that, again, there's a lot of intersection, but there are also ways that you can do different things, knowing, say, that your poems will be on the page, or knowing that your poems will be spoken aloud, and maybe your audience will have access to seeing your gestures and your expressions and hearing your voice's inflection. Like I ran into this problem kind of recently because I have this chapbook of tiny little experimental single word poems. Hard to describe other than saying that. But if you just read them aloud, it doesn't track and it doesn't make sense. But if you see them, then it sort of does. So yeah, I just think it's a really rich realm, and it's like complicated and nuanced, and I like that about poetry.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and kind of just circling back to some of what both Mag and Tarfia were saying about, this, it's an OG form of storytelling, and it's also a very efficient and flexible form. And so it's, when you hear it aloud, right, on the stage, you can kind of, poetry is such a visual language, you can kind of see what is happening, as someone is performing it for you. And there's flexibility in terms of how you can interpret it. I mean, like, plays used to have a lot of meter and poetry and music to them, and those were performed. And nowadays, I mean, we have poetry that is, turning into kind of like pseudo music videos, or like people are making poetry in motion videos where they, to me, like when I watch videos like that, like I think Poetry in Motion is a YouTube channel where they translate poems into a visual form of storytelling. Like it does to me feel like an interpretation of the poem, and it's very performative, and it feels like you're kind of like watching a really fun music video with lots of language in there. To me, that's really exciting, that you can sort of witness the poem in that way. And you can't really necessarily do that with fiction, or like, movies adapting stories or novels, right? It seems like you're always missing something, but with the poem, you always have the language kind of backing up the visual. So I really enjoy that. And I think it's people are doing really exciting things with it. Like even like I've seen people do like performance art with poems and stuff. So, or choreography with poems, like dance and stuff like that. So it's very flexible in that way too.
I love that. I'm learning so many things about like the poetry scene. This is cool. All three of you have been published in literary magazines. And Mag, you have a chapbook. Tarfia, you have 2 poetry collections. A lot of people that are here tonight or that will watch this video, they are going to be in the process of trying to figure out, how do I put my poetry out in the world? What's the best process, or what are even the processes? Would you like to share like how you got your poetry published, what it took? Because yeah, chapbook, poetry collection, literary magazine, all different processes. Yeah, Tarfia, do you want to start?
Sure. It's I guess the process is being told no a lot at first for a good long while, and I think getting comfortable with rejection, and getting comfortable with rejection not necessarily meaning that the poem or the work of writing is a failure. And I think consistency was, I think all the answers are actually kind of boring. They're sort of things like discipline, developing a thick skin, going back to the drawing board, not giving up on your poems, not giving up on wanting to see them in certain places. And so for me, it was really gradual. I don't think there was anything I submitted to that I got into the first time, or, I remember there was one particular relationship I had with this journal called Shenandoah, which is based in the South. This is Southern Literary Journal. And when I first started sending poems out, it was before Submittable. And I remember I was sending poems to them pretty much. They had a really quick turnaround time, like I think 6 weeks or something like that, which was pretty short, right? So I kept getting these like form rejection postcards in the mail that were sort of like, your poem, short story, piece of nonfiction, essay has not been accepted at this time, whatever. And then I think the third time I sent there, they circled poem, and I was like, I'm going somewhere now, finally. And then I think the fourth or fifth time, it was like there was a small note that was written that was sort of encouraging. And now that I think of it, I have still never been accepted at that literary journal, although I've been published in a lot of other literary journals since. But I think I just wanted to share that story to illustrate that I do think a lot of it is being willing to put yourself out there and not giving up on your work, and also allowing that opportunity of rejection to be an opportunity to go back to the drawing board and keep working on your poems and see if you have done as much for them as you thought you had. So I'll just start there.
Can I just ask you a quick question? Did you need a literary agent to get your poetry collections published?
No, I sent to a lot of contests. I think that's a pretty typical model still for how books of poetry get published. There are open reading periods that certain presses do, like Hopper Canyon and Graywolf both have open reading periods, for example. But often it's through literary prizes that have a single judge. An outside judge is usually invited in to pick the final manuscript, and a lot of poetry collections make their debut that way, I would say.
Yeah, I definitely can speak to that process of submitting work, being rejected. And I think it's really hard because we try, when you begin to kind of acclimate yourself to the literary world, then you start to hear like, oh, rejection is going to happen or whatever. And I think we try to convince ourselves that like, yeah, I don't even think, I don't have hope. I'm just going to send this out for no reason. I don't actually think they're going to take it. And then we kind of like chastise ourselves when the no comes back, and then some part of you does kind of hurt. Because you're like, oh, well, I shouldn't, feel that way. Well, you should. It's okay. It's okay to be bummed, and of course, some part of you hoped maybe it would happen. And shoot, maybe it will happen. Maybe it would have, Some of it's like so arbitrary. Whose desk out of the maybe 30 poetry readers at X, Y, or Z big fancy journal did your poem land on? Because if it was the wrong person, then it might have been shut down right then and never made it up the ladder to anybody else who may have loved it. So it's tricky. The best advice I ever got was to play the odds. And I think sometimes there's like a stigma about really being honest about how much you have to send your work out there. And unfortunately, when it comes to sending contest work and things like that, like how much money you have to spend. Like I've spent probably $2,000 sending my first full manuscript to various contests at various presses. And it's done really well. It's been a finalist 7 times. It's been a semifinalist 12 times, which means, top 25, top 10 out of usually like 1,000 manuscripts. So that's really exciting, but I still don't have a full-length poetry manuscript and I'm still broke from it. And probably won't ever like earn out what I've spent sending it around. Do I think that makes me a bad or illegitimate poet? No, I think it makes me a normal poet. And I do feel like it pushes me to improve my work and to have the opportunity for a better debut book every time that I get rejected. When I first started sending poems to journals, it took 4 years for the first place to pick up my work. But I did notice there was kind of a snowball effect. You know, I just kept putting myself out there. I kept meeting people in the literary world, going to events. I was fortunate to be able to go to higher education in creative writing. And so at some point, things began to pick up. You just have to play the odds until you hit some kind of stride. What happens before that can be totally subjective and arbitrary. So yeah, that would be my advice.
I mean, I don't have a chapbook or a book yet, but I can speak to you know, what has been said already by Tarfia and Mag, and I mean, just basically persistence is really key, you know, and reading widely is also really key to you know, putting your work out there, because you might not know where to begin with sending out your work. You might not know that you know, that there is a home for your work, because I believe that there is a home for your work starting out. You know, there are right now, you know, there's never been a better time to publish poetry. I mean, there's so many places nowadays and so many presses, and it's very competitive because there are so many people writing poetry and so many people that want to publish it, and it's really exciting. But it can also feel discouraging, you know, when people do say no. But I would say persistence is really key. I heard the story of, you know, Jake Adam York, who now has a book prize named after him, and I mean, you know, passed away, but he has a book prize named after him. And I heard that for his first book, it was sent out over 200 times before it was finally picked up, and now he has a book prize named after him. So I mean, I would say persistence is really key.
I love that. Thank you. Sebastian, I'm gonna come right back to you. You're the founder of The Boiler and the poetry editor at Deep Vellum. Can you kind of expand on your roles there and what you look for, coming from like the publishing side, what you're looking for when it comes to poets who are submitting to you?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I've been, you know, editing work or curating. I like to see my role as kind of like a curator, because I mean, sometimes, you know, when work comes to me, there isn't very much editing that I do, you know, in terms of like, you know, addressing any line by line issues. I mean, you know, but The Boiler, I started about 9 years ago. It's almost going to be 10 years ago now. And, you know, I was just really interested in being a part of a literary community. You know, after I finished my MFA, I didn't, you know, have a community anymore. And so doing that kind of work was a really great way to keep me connected to, you know, what people are writing. And so it was very fulfilling in that. And I think it's really exciting to promote authors and support them and the work that they do and to see them succeed. But I guess what I was looking for, you know, when I started out was just like, you know, stuff that excited me. We're called The Boiler, and one of our sort of descriptions in our about page is, you know, we like work that is under pressure, that has that heat in it. And so, and like I said before, you know, there's so much excellent poetry out there, and you know, but there's only so much time and attention that you can give to poems or to any work that you publish, because, you know, we're an online journal, and, you know, that might seem like, you know, you could publish as many things as you want, but, you know, with promoting a single issue, right, there's only so much time and attention that you can give with promoting, you know, individuals' work. So we are limited in the amount of work that we can publish, even though it might seem like we could publish an infinite amount in any given issue. But we want the work to stand on its own and to really draw you in from the get-go. So I look for really strong openings, really strong first pages, really strong, you know, first lines, first sentences. I mean, that's really key. And when you are getting like hundreds of submissions in any given submission period, you know, and you have these screeners that are working at these various literary magazines, which I've been a screener for other magazines as well. And, you know, sometimes, you know, if the reader's not drawn into the first page, you know, they're just gonna, you know, pass on it, right? And so it's very important to have a really good first sentence, a really good opening, and also to ultimately, you know, keep that up. You know, you have to be consistent with, you know, if you're going to start strong, you got to finish strong as well, because, you know, sometimes a piece can be really strong and then, you know, you get to the ending and then it kind of disappoints you, you know, so you got to, you know, keep that attention, you know, that you started with. And I would say the same thing goes with Deep Vellum. I just started at Deep Vellum. It's almost going to be a year now. And with that, I mean, we take manuscripts, but, you know, I'm also like seeking them out myself, because, you know, I read widely, I read a lot of magazines and I follow a lot of writers on the internet. And so I'm always thinking about, you know, what kind of work, you know, I would like to see out there. But I'll stop there. But yeah, I would just say, you know, the first sentence or the first page is really important.
I'm so glad you mentioned that last thing, that you read widely, you read other literary magazines. This is like very common for editors. They will seek out work. So like put your work out there because people are paying attention. All three of you have received an MFA. So like you know, went and were able to immerse yourself in the literary scene within your university. I'm sure you all have people that you share work with, try to get feedback. What would be your advice for people who are poets who do want to improve their poetry? Are you for MFAs now that you've been in them? Are you for people, you know, seeking out editing services? Kind of, what are some advices that you have for people who are watching this? Yeah. Tarfia. I can see you and Mag like going, which one will go
I was
first?
playing chicken with the unmute button because I saw Tarfia going for it and I was like, yes, let her have it. So I think there are lots of ways that you can continue to improve your work, become more a part of the community, some of which can involve higher education and some of which definitely don't have to. I do think that it's vital, no matter what, to have in your mind, even when you do have a ton of publications, even when you've won awards, when you have books, you still need to be working on your writing. You still need to be trying to improve. Otherwise, why bother? I don't know. For me, that's the passion and the drive, is that I want to be a better writer. And I read every day and think about how I want my writing to grow. So I think it is important to find some kind of community where you can allow that to happen, you know, without just being isolated. If you have the resources to seek out an MFA, or if you are able to seek out potentially a fully funded MFA, personally, I think that's a great way to go. It can be time consuming. If you have a family, there are all kinds of things that could be barriers. But if you have the money and or if you're offered the funding, I would say that's great. It is really competitive right now. My MFA was a low residency MFA. I can't speak highly enough of my experience with that at UC Riverside. But essentially, for those of you who aren't familiar, if you have a low residency MFA, you travel to the university twice a year, usually for about 2 weeks. And you have very intensive in-person workshopping, guest speakers, lectures, all different kinds of activities there. And then in the interim, you work really closely with usually with an advisor in your genre who's giving you assignments and giving you direct feedback. You may have, as in with my case, I also had a cross-genre advisor I worked with. I got to choose another genre besides poetry to write, so I went with nonfiction. And then we would also have like group forums among the students as well online. So you don't have to pick up and move, which is really nice. And you basically just need to be able to get 10 days off from work twice a year. Yeah, if those aren't options, another thing I would suggest here in Dallas, we, at least prior to the pandemic, and certainly when things, God willing, level out at some point, we'll have more happy hour events like we did at Wild Detectives for writing workshops, where you can go and meet other writers and chat with people who teach classes and just kind of get a feel for it. More reading events, like we had at Deep Vellum. Sebastian and I host a reading series that has been on an indefinite hiatus for the time being. Go to those things, join a local writing group like Writers Guild or Writers Area of Dallas group. There's a bunch of them. And when you make those friendships, then you'll have somebody that you can bounce work off and get some feedback from. And yeah, a lot of writers offer editorial consultations too. I do whenever I have time available, and all of that info is on my website. I can't speak for Sebastian or Tarfia, but perhaps they do as well. I know many writers do. So that's another option too, again, if you have the resources, but I don't think it has to be a financially driven thing to get to become part of the community and to improve your work.
Yeah, and I would add that, I mean, yeah, you should get your MFA if you can, like Mag said. But I would say, like, you know, yeah, the MFA, and now there's like the PhD in creative writing. You know, those are things that you can do if you're looking for community. You know, it's kind of built into the program. But you know, I would also research, you know, the programs because, you know, like Max said, there are low residency programs. There might be, you know, there aren't actually that many in the Dallas area, any MFA programs. There are some PhD programs, but there are master's programs in creative writing if, you know, if we're thinking locally. But as Mag was saying, you know, there are, you know, there's Writing Workshops Dallas, there's your local bookstore. But I would also say, you know, you can also start your own community. When I moved back here from, because I'm a native Texan, but I did my MFA in New York. And when I came back, I was looking for a community. And so that's why I decided to start a reading series, you know, so that I could, you know, bring the community to me and kind of, you know, start building that for myself. And, you know, people seem to enjoy that, you know. So I would, you know, if you don't have one around you, you know, don't be afraid to start your own. And I wouldn't say that you need to have an MFA or PhD in creative writing to pursue writing. You know, you can always just take classes or just, you know, start your community, you know, on your own. If you want to go that route, you know, you know, I would say you should maybe think about going that route, especially if you want to think about teaching at some point. But I would say, you know, you can DIY your MFA or like DIY your creative writing experience if you'd like. That might even be better for you, especially in Dallas. I think Dallas really likes the DIY thing. So.
I'll just add quickly that I went to a traditional MFA and I go in and out of, again, like the battle of the value of the MFA is another cosmic battle I'm not particularly invested in. But I think that the challenge is that I think writing is a very solitary act at the end of the day. And you can find and create communities and figure out a way to participate in communities, but I'm going to speak up for people who might turn to writing as a place where they can be reclusive and alone. And I think it's a balance though, right? Like I think that trying to figure out how to negotiate that solitary space, which is kind of uncomfortable to have to face yourself more alone, and then negotiating that alongside community and getting feedback on your work. Sometimes you're not actually ready to share a piece. But I also think that the value in writing community is actually comes in the social experiment aspect of things, which is that you may have to encounter work you don't like. That's actually good for you, or work that you're envious of. That's also good for you because it activates your awareness of what kind of writer you want to be. And I also think hearing perspectives that even might be heinous to you, I think are sometimes reasons to actually engage with community, is the discomfort of it, the discomfort of encountering another person's perspective. So I think there's always something good about that. But I also think that sometimes in MFA experiences, I've also taught at the MFA level in a couple of different creative writing programs. And I see my students really struggle with trying to anticipate or what's going to happen next, or what the value of the experience is. And so I think, just as with anything else, I think it's a little bit easier and perhaps a little bit more productive if you can slow yourself down enough to just be present for the experience, even though it's so frustrating. I think no matter how many times we've been published, this is something I think Mag mentioned about, you still have to work on your writing. I think it actually in some ways gets harder. You have to constantly make sure that you're doing it for the legit reasons, that you still are doing it because you want to be a better writer, not because you want to be seen as a writer. And I think sometimes in those social environments, we can become hyper conscious of what we are and what we're not before we have the capacity. So I feel like community is a good place to develop that capacity. But as somebody who Irish goodbyes parties, like I also am happy to exit left from the community as well.
Thank you. I'm gonna go to Alexander's question. Can you all speak to your day-to-day experiences with writing? Do you do exercises? Does it involve reading? When you're working on your poems, what type of research are you doing? Like, kind of to what extent are you working on your poems on a day-to-day basis? Sebastian, do you want to go?
Yeah, I can go. So right now I'm teaching creative writing, and so what I tell my students is, like, there is no one way to write. I mean, I can only share what I do, personally, but what I like to encourage students to do is to find their own way of writing. What is, because we all write differently. Like, there is this idea that, serious writers write every day. They sit down and they set aside 8 hours to like work on 1,000 words or something like that. And that's not something that I do. I mean, I write very sporadically. Living it is also part of writing. Like observing and processing and like acting like a sponge to the world. I think that's part of writing too. Like not writing is writing too, and that can be part of your process. And you can give yourself permission to not always write every single day. And thinking of that exercise or reps metaphor. I mean, even when you are exercising, I mean, you do have your rest days where you let your muscles build, right? Where you don't maybe exercise like every single day. You have to let your brain or your writing muscles kind of rest every now and then. When I do write, the way I've been writing recently is where you know, I'll give myself a goal for a month to write a poem a day. And, you know, I'll do that maybe 2 or 3 times in a year. And, you know, maybe I'll save like 50% of those poems, and I'll return to them and, you know, build on the, you know, what I was thinking of at that time. And so that's my process right now. And as, you know, sometimes when I get stuck, I read a lot. I look for poems, you know, that I come back to, or books that I haven't read. And I'm thinking about, oh, how is this person writing? Or like, you know, maybe I can read this poem and it can inspire something in me. So that's kind of like how I write, but that's my process again. So like, you know, I think it's important for writers to find, you know, what works for them.
I can say working on something 10 hours a day, every day is not healthy, because I just did it for the last 2 weeks and I am dying. Sorry. Mag, Tarfia.
Yeah, so I'm a creature of habit, big time. I function on routine. All 3 of y'all here know this about me. So my process is kind of in some ways super different from Sebastian's. There are certain things I do every day, but I too do not write every day. But every day I spend an hour on the treadmill reading. I like to do that because I don't have my phone there. I'm not able to be distracted by anything else. And I don't want to be thinking about my body that's in pain on the treadmill. So I'm like focusing on my reading. So that's one thing I do every day. I tend to write best when I can devote a bigger chunk of time in a day, rather than I have so many poet friends who can sit down and whenever they have a small window here and there, kind of scribble things down and it all eventually comes together. So I'm the kind of person who would rather try to sort of compartmentalize my week and say, all right, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday are just teaching days. You know, I'm working on my class prep, I'm doing my comments for students or what have you. And then I'll try to set aside at least one, you know, most of the day a week, if I'm lucky, to really write, because I just tend to be more productive when I can spend a longer time. When I start writing, I have this like laminated binder, which I would show y'all, except my computer's sitting on it so that it's like a little raised above my desk. I have this laminated binder of favorite poems by other poets. And I flip through it before I write, and I read, you know, I'll pick like 3 poems that I want to be channeling something about that craft as I'm working. And I tend to find that really inspiring. Personally, yeah, I can't produce. If I tried to write a poem a day for a month, I would have 0 work by the end of the month, because it's a slow process for me. I might have 3 poems in progress at any given time. And if I'm lucky, I might finish 3 poems in a month. And that's okay. That's the pace that I can go at. I have to write the best that I can write. I think my advice, I have known a lot of folks who kind of say, like, writing is hard. Obviously, we all know that writing is really hard. But I've known folks to be like, gosh, how do you force yourself to like sit down and do it every day? And the one thing I would add is like, nobody's forcing you. You don't have to do that. You know, if it's not fun, if there's not a part of you that wants to come to the page and work on the writing, don't. It's okay. You can be great at so many things. Like for me, it's like a blessing and a curse how much I love to work on writing, even when I'm struggling, even when it sucks. All my friends, my family know, like, I have no life pretty much, because if I have free time, it's going to go to writing. That's what I want to be doing. And I hope that y'all can find that same joy in it at the end of the day, kind of no matter what the publishing scene looks like, what your community looks like, and whatever kinds of struggles you have to go through on the day-to-day otherwise.
Yeah, I second a lot of what has already been said, especially I think, when writers get together to talk about process, we always end up talking about reading for a reason. I think it's where a lot of us even began is by reading someone else's words and feeling sparked to write our own. But I feel like the question that was asked to me, the way I'm thinking about it is about, because like I think there's this things that we already know, going in and out of discipline and things like that. But I guess I want to talk about the reason to go to the page in the first place, which I think is to wrestle with things like things you're afraid to say, or to return to obsessions that persist. And I think that's a little bit different than the muscle of writing, which sure, one can develop by writing every day, by reading regularly. But I think going to the site of suffering, or the site of anxiety, or the site of like, kind of like recursive obsession, I think that's a different thing. And I think all of the practice is towards trying to really keep the signal clear, so that you can pay attention to those moments where you feel like you are really doing something, like you are really, your heart starts beating faster, you start sweating a little bit, maybe you get emotional. And I think those moments do not happen every day necessarily, but they happen because you have done the work of showing up every day, or like regularly with your attention, to go back to what Sebastian was saying about it not being about necessarily drafting every day. And yeah, so I guess like I think that's a big part of it. I think that's the real exercise, and the effort of it is facing what you are afraid to say and making yourself say it as many times as you need to.
Yes, sit in that discomfort. It does breed good writing. If anybody else has any questions, we're kind of nearing the end. So feel free. I don't know, Blake, if you want people to do like the raise hand thing, or to write it in the chat box.
Well, yeah, if y'all can unmute yourself if you have a question, that would be kind of fun. So feel free to unmute yourself and we can have a conversation. But if y'all don't have any questions, or if you don't, or maybe you want to put them in the chat, but whatever you're comfortable with.
And I have some more questions if nobody has one. All right. Okay, I asked you, all three of you, if you had a craft book on poetry or writing that you wanted to suggest to readers or to attendees tonight. Would you like to share what your book was and why you chose that one? I know Mag has hers on hand.
I do. Yeah, I picked this book, Poetry: A Writer's Guide into Anthology. It's edited by Amarak Huey and W. Todd Kaneko, two wonderful poets and editors. And what I like about this book is it's kind of an all-in-one package. I'll just read y'all some of the like table of contents here to give you an idea what it's got. So there's section 1, an introduction to poetry. Why do we write poems? What is meaning? What does talent have to do with anything? Where do poems come from? What does it mean to be a poet? So some like philosophical angles on poetry to get you started. And then they go into like the craft elements in section 2, rhetorical construction, different techniques like beginnings, clarity, diction, endings, form, and a bunch of others. Oh my gosh, so many others. Image, mood, metaphor, rhythm, syntax. Then there's section 3 that kind of talks more about next steps. So the poetry workshop, revision, and proceed with caution are the titles of those chapters. Then there's a whole gigantic, wonderful anthology that's just filled with like really fabulous, Tarfia's in here, hello. Really fabulous poets. Really, really formally and stylistically diverse work. And they have it sectioned out into handy little areas like the elegy, list poems, love poems. So, I mean, this right here is like your DIY MFA, or at least year one of that.
Sebastian, do you have a suggestion on a poetry craft book or writing craft book that you would suggest?
Yeah, my book wasn't actually a poetry craft book. I actually think, you know, what I've been told over and over again, you know, it's good for poets to not just read poetry or just work from poets. Sometimes it can be useful to think of people who are writing in other genres, you know, and I think that's one of the things I love about poetry is that, you know, like I said, you know, there's this blurring of genre and you can inform poetry from so many different sources. And so the book I chose was Create Dangerously by Edwidge Danticat. And I was first turned on to her work because I was interested in this idea of like the art of death. The Graywolf has this really amazing series that is by different authors, and they're called The Art of, and they have them for different genres. And that book, so she wrote one called The Art of Death, where she's meditating on grief and how that kind of loosely informs her work. And this is kind of like, I don't know, I feel like it's kind of in conversation with it, you know, because she's thinking about very personal things. And it kind of reminds me of something that Tarfia was mentioning earlier about, you know, like, you know, why are we writing, you know, where do we need to go in order to access, you know, the source of, you know, our inspiration, you know, the site of anxiety or the site of, you know, how do you, you know, how can you make it feel like you're risking something? And so for Danticat, she's talking about, you know, being this immigrant writer from the Caribbean, and you know, she's thinking about her country that's in crisis, and you know how that is sort of motivating for her to feel like she has something worth saying. And so that's why I would recommend this book, because it you know, if you're wanting to think of ways you know, to make your writing more personal, I think that this is, and to also feel like you're actually risking something, I think Danticat's book, Create Dangerously, is a good one for that.
Thank you, Sebastian. Tarfia, the only reason I'm going to stop you on asking about your craft book is because you've got a question, and I know that you have to leave like right at 7. In your poem, Register of Illuminated Villages, you play with time. How did you draft that poem? What was the process like? There's so many threads in this brilliant poem. And that was from Sonia.
Thank you for your question, Sonia. Oh, I think I said I had to leave at 7:15, so we're
Okay.
for a second, but okay, so what do I want to say about that poem? How did I draft that poem? It was a really long time ago. This is like, this is such a cop out that I'm pulling right now to just sort of be like, I don't remember, but I don't remember exactly how that poem came to be, except that I felt like, I think that there is something about the experience of time that is built into my experience of writing poetry. This maybe brings us all the way back to the very first question about why poetry, because I just think that there's a way that poetry allows for time to sort of move and be collapsed that I'm really fascinated by. And so for those of you who haven't read this poem, this is a poem in which I sort of go back and forth in time between a kind of sort of, it's not exactly clear, but a previous time and also a present moment. And so in the poem, there's a speaker who is lying is basically dealing with insomnia and is imagining things that never ever happened to her, but that she's aware of happening to other people. And so it has the effect of doing what I think poetry is really cool for, which is time traveling. And so I think that this maybe connects to the question about the craft book, which my pick was this book called 3 Steps on the Ladder of Writing by Hélène Cixous, who is a French writer who is now dead. I have a thing for dead writers. I don't know. And I think like what I like about her book is that she talks about writing as a metaphysical act. And so that poem that you're talking about, Sonia, came for me as a result of sort of being in this sort of like half dream, half awake state and wanting to write into how to kind of convey that experience of time when you're sort of in and out of it. You're sort of aware that it's sort of nighttime, but it could be 3, 4, 5 in the morning. And those sorts of like spaces where dreaming meets sort of the kind of like, I don't know, dreaming meets death meets, you know, sort of like you're thinking about something that happened in 2nd grade all of a sudden. So I just think, I guess that poem came out of me trying to get all of that into a poem. Get all of that into one place with some kind of cohesion. And also I think like, I feel like a lot of poems make a record that in some ways honors the experience of both the present moment, but the awareness of other timelines.
Thank you. That was so great. I'm actually like, was trying to copy and paste this link to go get 3 Steps on the Ladder of Writing. Because that
Ben
sounds.
has also recommended that book to me, Tarfia. I'm glad you just talked about it because I haven't read it yet, but yeah, I've heard really good things about it.
Sebastian likes it, right?
It's not like a straight up craft book, I have to say. Like it's really more like it's like if a book was like wasabi for the brain. It's like the mind blown emoji just over and over again, where you're just like, that is what being alive is like. Why? So I don't know if it's going to help anybody with writing, but
I like that book. It's really good, but yeah, it is kind of weird to read. You have to, there are some parts where you kind of have to read it over to kind of like really process it. But I really like it and it's beautiful. I would also second Mag's recommendation. I've used that anthology, that Mag mentioned. It's really good. It's very detailed and very specific. But Tarfia's book made me also think of this other book that is recommended to me, which was The Art of Time, which is another Graywolf book. And there's one for, the one that was recommended to me was by Joan Silber. But I know that there's another Art of Time for nonfiction, and I forget who the author is of that, but I think it can be very useful for poets who are thinking about time in their poems as well.
Great. Thank you all for being here today. Before we leave, just if you have any events or things that you want to plug, that people can connect with you in the future, whether you're doing like classes, readings online, in person, etc. Do you have
I have a few things coming up. Most of them are virtual in the next few months. I do have one reading in New York City on October 22nd at the 92Y Unterberg Poetry Center. So I'll be there. But I try to, and I'm sure this is probably the case with Tarfia and Sebastian too, I have a list of all the upcoming events and links where they're applicable, so folks can get more info and register. I would definitely love to see some of y'all there.
You have links on your website, right?
Yeah.
Is what you're trying to say? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, I do just want to plug in 2 weeks. We've got the Big Texas Read and the San Antonio Poet Laureate, Octavio Quintanilla, I believe. But he will be there in 2 weeks, and it's going to be great. And he was the San Antonio Poet Laureate for 2 years, just ended in 2020. So it should be great. He's a great poet. So I put the link there in the chat, along with all of the other, all the books that our 3 panelists mentioned. So if you want to click on those and the links, it'll take you to Interabang books or Graywolf books or Bookshop.
Tarfia, Sebastian, do you want to plug anything before we go? No? Okay. I just want to say thank you so much for being here tonight, for sharing all of this great advice with everybody here. I'm sure everybody appreciated it as much as I did. I've learned so much about poetry and just connected with a lot of stuff that you all said as somebody who comes from a different genre. I really hope to see you all in person soon, hopefully at literary events if we can get some stuff together. World, figure it out. But thank you again. Thank you everybody for being here tonight. And I hope to see you at the next Lit Talk. Bye.
Thank you, Alex.